Good morning. Thank you very much, Tricia, for that very kind introduction. It makes me feel I should maybe quit while I'm ahead. Look, I thank you for calling it remarks because I don't have a prepared speech. I think in the spirit of dialogue, I'd like to speak with the participants this morning rather than talk at them. But in thinking about the subject today, since I was invited to come on, I've given some thought to what liberalism means to me, and I think I'd like to sort of unpack that a little bit before considering how it applies in the COVID context. So liberalism, first of all, I guess most people in the street, when they think of liberalism, they think that it means being progressive, the condition of being left-leaning versus being conservative. I actually don't think that's what liberalism is. It's not the way political scientists classically define the term. And I'll give you an example. In Australia, the ruling party is the Liberal Party. They've been in government now for 7 years, and the Liberal Party defines themselves as being a centre-right party. And they are relatively conservative in terms of social and economic policy. Versus the Labour Party, which is the opposition. But they still insist on the term liberal. And that's because for the Liberal Party in Australia and for me, true liberalism isn't about where you sit on the conservative progressive spectrum. It means something else. It means liberty, it means equality, and it means the consent of the governed. Let me talk about those things a little bit. By liberty, I mean liberalism insists that you and I, Tricia, should be able to live our lives more or less as we want within certain loosely defined confines, within the law, as long as we're not bothering other people. I can wear a short sleeve batik on Sunday and you can wear a blue kabaya if that's what it is, and no one else can tell us otherwise. That's very important. If you take it to the extreme, you become not liberal, but libertarian. And libertarians tend to say that government should stay out of their lives entirely beyond, putting up traffic lights. And they don't want to pay tax except maybe for defense. So that's kind of one aspect of liberalism, I think. The idea that you're left alone to live your life more or less as you wish. The other one is equality, and that's very important. And the opposite of equality, I think, is not conservatism again, it's majoritarianism. That's really important. And I'll give you a for instance. When I called on the president of the PAS party first time, he explained to me PAS's philosophy, which was that Malay Muslims are the majority of Malaysians, and therefore they should make the rules of the country. He explicitly rejected the idea that if Indians are 9%, then they should have 9% of the political authority. Same with Chinese, indigenous, and others. Now, this is a legitimate political philosophy, majoritarianism. But of course, majoritarianism also comes with its problems. It doesn't always make for the most harmonious society. So in Australia, we reject majoritarianism and we adopt equality, which is to say the majority might disagree with a choice I make, but I still get to make that choice. So it's a difference between democracy and majoritarianism, by the way. Democracy is about the majority choosing the government, but majoritarianism versus liberalism says exactly what the government can and can't do after it's been elected. So that's very important. And you mentioned that I've got a human rights background, and that's the theory of human rights. Human rights, in a way, is anti-democratic, right? Because 99.9% of the people should tell me I cannot wear maroon on a Sunday, but I have that right. And so therefore, that's how liberalism works. The last part of my understanding of liberalism is the consent of the governed. And here, it puts liberalism in contradistinction with authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, we know what that is. Unfortunately, in this part of the world, democracy is not necessarily the dominant political philosophy throughout all the countries of East Asia. Malaysia stands as a shining exception in that regard. Authoritarianism is predominant in a number of countries and growing in some others that we've traditionally thought of as democratic and part of the international liberal order. So that's kind of my understanding of where liberalism is, because I don't think it's about LGBT or smoking marijuana. It's not. It's really about those fundamental political precepts which are very important that we all understand. It stands in contradistinction to majoritarianism and authoritarianism. What does that mean for Malaysia and Australia? What does it mean for the world in terms of how we deal with a crisis? And we're in at least two crises now, right? There's a pandemic and there's an economic crisis, and other things might flow from that, political crises, etc. There is one strong voice in the region coming from Beijing that is using the opportunity of this period of crisis to make a political point. And the political point that is being made is that authoritarianism is a much more successful system than liberalism in dealing with a crisis. And Beijing points to China's undoubted success in managing the COVID crisis. And they also say that it's not just authoritarianism, but also Confucianism, the Confucian culture, which has allowed a greater degree of success in other countries. And of course, they've been mocking some Western responses. Now, from my point of view, from where I'm sitting, it's hard to reach the conclusion that a society's level of political freedom is a good predictor of how they have managed the COVID crisis. For example, a number of democracies have done extremely well. And I'm thinking now particularly of Malaysia and Australia. Also, a number of other democracies which happen also to be Confucian have done very well, including Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan. And until recently, Hong Kong was a vibrant democracy and also did very well in its management of COVID. So I think that kind of undercuts a little bit the theory that there's only one culture that does well in a crisis and only one political system that does well. In fact, I think the authoritarian model for dealing with a crisis has its own problems. And the problems largely revolve around credibility. When you have, say, an Angela Merkel speaking to the German people in that calm, measured way that she does, she carries enormous credibility. People believe her because she leads a government which is classically liberal, is transparent, and is open to ideas and criticism. That's very important because no government, however clever the members of the particular party are, ever has all the right ideas. The best way to manage any problem in governance, whether it be a crisis, whether it be an economy, whether it be social development, I think has been demonstrated is the democratic way, where governments work in concert with the people, the consent of the governed, remember, to come up with ideas which are then critiqued broadly and shared with the public through a skeptical and free media. Those have always been the keys to government success. And I would put it to you that that will remain the case in the future. So as I said, there's been mockery of the way some governments in the West have handled the problem. But I think we will find that those mistakes, when they're made, are very self-correcting. And I think, as you said in your introduction, even this weekend, we've seen an example of where a sophisticated society has chosen a different path because of the experience that they've had. That ability to choose a different path is something which is unique to liberal democracies. The other thing is liberal democracies sometimes are slow to recognize a threat or a challenge. 2 world wars have proven to us that we don't always get the memo early. But when we do, we're very, very good at responding. That also is the lesson of history. Another lesson of history is democracies are better at learning lessons. And as an example, let me point to the fact that countries like Taiwan and Korea and Japan were very good at learning from the example of SARS. So they were ready for this pandemic in a way that other countries weren't. Beijing actually wasn't as effective in that regard because authoritarian regimes depend on propaganda and censorship to manage their issues of legitimacy. And that then undercuts the ability to learn lessons. Let me read something to you that I didn't write. It was written by Ben Ami, who is the vice president of the Toledo International Center for Peace. But I think he puts it rather well. He writes, "The problem isn't that Beijing didn't learn its lesson. The problem is that it couldn't." And that is the point. In a democracy, a crisis is a political test. A leader must retain or strengthen the public's trust or risk being voted out at the next election. But in an autocracy, a crisis is a threat to the regime's legitimacy, indeed its survival. With such high stakes, a cover-up will always seem like the safest bet. I think that's it for me. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. I've been very open with my ideas and I hope people engage in the same spirit, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Tricia.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. So if I may just ask members of the audience to put their questions in the Q&A box, and we will be able to ask His Excellency some questions. But perhaps the first one for me would be, you talked about the difference between majoritarianism and liberalism. And the distinction there is that liberalism elects the people in power, and majoritarianism would like that government that is already elected in power to continue being to continue making its policy decisions with majority support. Is that a correct distinction between the two terms that you meant? Because I mean there's also calls for there to be democracy between elections, right? So there are a lot of people who talk about how local democracy should take place not just at the ballot box, but in between the 5-year period. There are ways in which there can be public participation, contributing to, say, the budget, analyzing the accountability of what government does. I mean, shouldn't that be also considered as liberalism throughout the time and not just at the ballot box?
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. Both liberalism and majoritarianism are democratic models because, as you say, the election looks the same. The question is what happens afterwards. Do people have equality afterwards? Do they have the capacity to affect government decisions? Do they have the capacity to even participate in governing processes? I've always said that democracy is not an event that happens once every 3, 4, or 5 years. It's a way in which society is managed, the way in which society manages itself. And for me, Malaysia is, I mean, I don't want to participate too much in the internal political debates, but I see Malaysia as being very high up on the spectrum of classic liberalism. This is a genuine democracy, and if it wasn't before May 2018, it certainly is now.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you've already answered a question that has been posed, which is, do you perceive that Malaysia is a liberal country? So you've sort of answered that, but you can feel free to expand on that later. But I have a question here about affirmative action. So do you see that affirmative action is consistent with liberalism? And how has Australia addressed this? So I think it's a very pertinent question also for Malaysia for obvious reasons.
Yes, I think it is. Because remember, I defined liberalism, one of the definitions for me is equality. And equality doesn't mean everyone is treated the same, because some people need to be treated differently in order to achieve equality. And that's where affirmative action comes in. So in Australia, we have affirmative action programs for Indigenous people, for people who are suffer physical disabilities. There are various programs which try to protect the vulnerable, to empower women and girls. All of these things are social policies designed to advance equality rather than to retard it. There's a great cartoon, I think, which describes this very well. It shows three people trying to watch a football game over a fence: a tall person, a medium-sized person, and a short person. And it shows that perfect equality means that the short person doesn't get to see anything, you know. But when you put little blocks underneath the shorter ones, then everyone gets to see the same thing. Those blocks don't actually impede equality; they help achieve it.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think it's also something that we grapple with, right? Like sort of equality of opportunity versus equality of outcomes. And I think it depends, you know, like where on the spectrum you would lie. I mean, my current thinking is that we would be for equality of opportunities and not necessarily of outcomes, because that can distort things quite significantly, and it also has, you know, quite major unintended consequences in other ways. Okay, but let's not get my own questions in too much. But all right, a question is from Andrew Koo. Where do refugees and asylum seekers sit in this contestation between liberalism and majoritarianism? So also relevant for both Australia and Malaysia.
Right. Okay. Well, good morning, Andrew. Nice to have you on. Look, it's a good question. I think it fits into the construct in the same way as everybody else fits. In a liberal democracy where rights are protected, then the rights of asylum seekers are also protected. Now, exactly what rights they're accorded will be a matter of policy, and that will vary from society to society. But the idea that they are excluded from enjoying human rights simply because of the means of their arrival, of course, is contrary to a liberal philosophy. So it's not a simple answer to the question, obviously, but in a liberal democracy, asylum seekers not only will be accorded their minimum rights, they will be able to participate in the discussion and in the determination of what their rights ought to be. And others, on their behalf, will be able to participate in those policy debates as well. That's another defining character of liberal democracy, is the idea that you can have an open discussion where not everyone agrees. And that is something which, of course, is inimical to an authoritarian society.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, there's a lot of questions here now, so I'm not sure if we can get through everything because we do have a next panel. So 10:45 is when I'm going to move to the next panel. But I'm going to put a couple of questions together here. So one from Sun Hawk is, how do we prevent tyranny of the majority, especially if the majority was secured through unbridled gerrymandering? So I'm going to kind of link that to the second question from Elisa, which is that, you know, authoritarianism-based governments tend to censor the media and use propaganda, right, to show their credibility. However, these days, democratic-based governments are also doing the same thing to prove their credibility. So what are your views on these actions to show government legitimacy? So one is about, you know, gerrymandering and then tyranny of the majority, and then the other one is about censorship of the media.
Okay, so tyranny of the majority. This is majoritarianism, right? I mean, it's the problem of a dominant group defining themselves as dominant and deciding that the views and interests of the minority, whatever that is, will be set aside. I mean, there's a few problems with that. It's difficult to make for a happy and harmonious society. It's difficult to be sustainable and successful as a society. And the third problem is, if you believe that, then sometimes you'll be in the majority, but sometimes you won't. And therefore, you will also be joining the oppressed, as it were. The classic way to avoid that is through a wholehearted adoption of human rights. That's why the international human rights system was developed after World War II, because the system that prevailed before World War II was might makes right. And basically, I, as the president or prime minister or emperor, can do what I like in my own country, and nobody else can say anything. This is my business, not your business. After World War II, we as a human race decided that your human rights, Tricia, are my business, and my human rights are your business. And that's why we developed the whole structure, particularly the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And it's called universal because every single country adheres to it. Underneath that, we have a whole panoply of treaties and conventions. Not every country belongs to every one, but that is the objective. Malaysia, for a variety of historical and political reasons, is one of the democracies that has adhered to the fewest number of international human rights treaties. And that's very important because when you choose to adhere to a human rights treaty, you are basically rejecting majoritarianism. You are saying that a minority, whether it's defined by disability, by race, by ethnicity, gender, in any other way, still has rights and will be held accountable to those rights. And that is a very important element. On the question of propaganda, that's difficult as well. You know, again, it's not a clear black and white because every government, even the most liberal democratic, still likes to get its message across and is tempted sometimes to use government mechanisms to advertise their success or their point of view. That's a given. But there are certain lines that shouldn't be crossed. And I think we know what they are. Malaysians are sufficiently skeptical and well-informed that they know where those lines are. And when they see them being crossed, they shout out. And we're seeing that today. I had a lunch here just last week with a whole bunch of CEOs and senior editors of media publications, some of which have seen the inside of a jail and some of whom are currently facing charges. So it's a live debate in Malaysia. It's a live debate, but it's one that Malaysians have to win because there's only a few barriers between liberal democracy and authoritarianism. And one of them is a free press. Another one is a parliament that's allowed to operate. And a third one is an independent judiciary. But in some ways, the media is the front line.
All right, thank you very much, Your Excellency. All right, there are many questions coming. I don't think we can address everything, but I want to talk about the US election because that's just happened, right? And I agree with this question from an anonymous attendee saying that the US election has shown how divided democratic politics has become. Liberalism is one of the main victims. So, you know, if liberalism is positive, why is it in decline? And what's the reason for this deep divide that we're seeing?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I really don't know the answer. But I am fundamentally an optimist. I mean, of course, as a diplomat and Australian, I have no view about who should have won the US election. But I think what elections in true democracies, and the US is a true liberal democracy, and the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are both liberal parties, according to the classic understanding of that term. It shows the self-correcting nature of democracy. People can make a decision and then they can correct that decision. And like the wisdom of crowds, democratic electorates tend to get the answer right more times than they get it wrong, I think. That's certainly Australia's experience. We change governments not very frequently, but fairly regularly. And generally looking back, you can see why the electorate made that decision. So I still have a strong optimism that although at the moment democracy does seem to be in retreat in some ways, I think the natural predisposition of human beings to want to have a say in their government will prevail. And I think we'll see that trend reverse itself in due course.
Okay, thank you very much, Your Excellency. I mean, of course, yes, it's good that we are able to have those self-correcting mechanisms. But having said that, I do think the new US president will have a much more difficult and challenging time given the numbers within the House and the Senate as well. Okay, another big topic, and you can choose how you want to answer this. Again, from Andrew, you say that Malaysia is a good example of democracy, but what about the role of the sovereign and the monarchy. So what role ought they to play? Should they have the same ability and powers as that which led the Governor General of Australia to sack Goledzinowski? Very specific there, Andrew.
Yeah, very specific. Well, the answer is that it's up to each individual country to determine its own constitutional model. The Malaysian model is actually very similar to the Australian, as Andrew knows. That was a very controversial episode in our history in 1975, where we had the opposition was able to block the budget during the Whitlam government because we have a bicameral parliament like you do, and in the upper house, the opposition had the numbers and they blocked supply. That created a constitutional crisis. Gough Whitlam didn't want to go to the people and have an election because he wasn't confident of his numbers, and the stalemate was resolved with the Governor General dismissing the government, putting in a caretaker, and calling an election. That will be debated for as long as we have debates in Australia. The situation here in Malaysia is a little bit different, although it's parallel. But essentially, you need to have a circuit breaker. If not a sovereign, then a president. You know, some governments which are parliamentary choose to have a president, like in Singapore. I don't know Singapore's system, but you often need a circuit breaker when there's a constitutional political crisis. And in most cases, that circuit breaker means an election. In some cases, it doesn't. I won't comment on the specifics of Malaysia's situation, but again, I've got a lot of confidence that Malaysia and Malaysians know what they're doing and will continue to figure it out successfully.
All right, thank you. So what I'm going to do now is I will kind of just talk about the gist of the remaining questions, all of them, and then I'll pass the time to you to answer, and also in the same breath provide your last final words and thoughts on the whole subject, and then we will need to wrap this session up. So there is a question about how the state can empower people in policy making and what's the role of civil society. There's a second question about the maturity level of the community in choosing the right leaders and government. So, you know, the ability to analyze and discern a situation versus obedience, and what are the impacts as a result of that. There's a question on the Australian Aboriginals, but I think you've already answered that. And then just last two remaining questions. One is, do you equate equality with equitability? Which is a good question. And finally, what should the answer be for governments trying to fight pandemics and also preserve democracy? So through feedback from populations and dialogues and so on. And I'll put one in here just because it's Beverly Joman from the CSO platform for Reform Malaysia. So that CSO platform was set up after the 9th of May Pakatan Harapan victory. And they were able to make some inroads. But with the PN government, that's not a chosen government, how can the CSOs now best engage with a government like this? So it's really up to you, you know, which ones you'd like to prioritize. And then I'll also leave you to provide your closing thoughts on this whole topic.
Okay, well, that was a lot of interesting questions. Okay, about the empowerment of individuals and civil society, absolutely critical. When I said earlier that there were 3 obstacles for an authoritarian regime to get to, or to get over in order to have an authoritarian regime, I said media, I said independent judiciary, and a functioning parliament. I should have added a 4th one, which is vibrant civil society. Civil society, traditional role is to hold governments to account, and then using the media to do that publicly. I think that's critical. We've seen civil society take action on the streets in many countries to bring about political change. That doesn't have to happen. In a country like Malaysia, which I define as a liberal democracy, that can happen in a more consultative way. But I think civil society is integral to, not additional to, a functioning democratic system. On the maturity of the electorate and the media, the maturity of the electorate, that's really an important question. I think these days it's harder perhaps for people to make informed decisions than in the past, not because there's a lack of information, because there's too much. And the information is not being mediated through traditional media. It's coming at you from all angles, and it's very hard to determine its veracity, authenticity, or value. I think that's a big question. And I think media is partly the problem, but partly the answer. Media has a responsibility to play a role of educating the public. Government and educational institutions also have a role to ensure that, that governance is something which is understood by an informed electorate. So an informed electorate is a good electorate. The question on equality and equity, I think that's a very good one. In fact, the cartoon I was mentioning where the three people, one can see the game, one almost can and one can't at all. But when you give them the boxes, then they all can see it. That's the difference between what I should have said was equality and equity. Equality means some people will see, some people won't. Equity means everybody gets to see the game. So I think that is an important distinction. And equity is what we should be seeking, not equality. The question of how to deal with pandemics, feedback from civil society. Yes, again, as I said in my earlier remarks, a government dealing with a crisis has to act quickly. You know, if you're in a burning theatre, you don't want to form a committee on how to escape. You want one person to say, there's the exit, go that way. That's in a crisis. But crises also need feedback. They need to be done in a consultative way because otherwise you do not get good outcomes. The pandemic crisis in Malaysia is being dealt with effectively, I think in part, because the government made an early decision to be open with the information. And that has enabled the public to have confidence in the advice they're receiving and to be able to participate in the discussion. Same with the economic crisis. I think that is critical. And I think Malaysia, like Australia, deserves pretty high marks for how it's been done. We'll look back and say it could have been done better, no doubt, but I think pretty high marks compared to the rest of the world. And the last question was about how can CSOs engage with a government that hasn't been elected? I'm going to dispute the premise of that question a little bit because Malaysia is a parliamentary system like Australia's. I believe that the change of government that took place in February was entirely legal and legitimate. In Australia, it happens exactly the same way. A prime minister can be chosen on the floor of the parliament by a majority of members without there being an election. That's how it works. Political parties are not mentioned in our constitution as they are not mentioned in your constitution. It's about the individual parliamentarians. Whether that always is right or wrong is another question. That's a political question. But I think CSOs in Malaysia should continue to engage with the government of the day as they always have done. Some governments, no doubt, will be more open to that, others less. But the solution is not to give up. The solution is to move forward. And Tricia, you gave me the chance to make a sort of a final comment. It's this. These discussions are very interesting academically, but they have real life consequences. In Malaysia, I think you know better than I that these are important issues that need to be resolved for Malaysia to continue to be the successful liberal democracy I think it has become. But it's also a real question in the region. You know, I said at the beginning that there are different views on what model is successful. And as a diplomat, I can tell you that in this era, in this part of the world, in East Asia, there is an active debate going on, ideological debate about what models the rest of this region should continue to follow. And I think Malaysia has an important role in participating in that debate and also by modeling and demonstrating the success of liberal democracy so that others can see how it works. So I really am grateful for the opportunity to come and speak with you. I suspect I've said about 50% more than I should have, but I've enjoyed it and I'm looking forward to hearing some of the rest of the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Your Excellency Andrew Goledzinowski, for sharing your Sunday morning with us and ideas. I believe that many people appreciated not just the opportunity to hear your thoughts, but also the opportunity to interact directly with you, which I don't think happens on a daily basis for many people. So thank you again, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future. We wish you all the very best in your remaining time here in Malaysia. And yes, let's see what Malaysia chooses in terms of its own path towards liberal democracy, we hope, as well as wishing you all the best in Australia as well. So with that, we'd like to close this session. And there have been some questions that were not able to be addressed. I think somebody asked about Singapore. And let's not forget that we still have an exciting panel ahead with very distinguished guests, and you can pose your questions to them as well. They will be very well suited to answer your questions. So with that, I'd like to close this session and pass the time back to our MC Iskandar. Oh yes, Your Excellency, you had something else to add?
One more thing, Tricia, look, I love speaking with Malaysians. If people want to follow me on social media, particularly on my Twitter account, I'm very active. I'm happy to respond to people personally, and I'd appreciate the opportunity to engage further.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for being so forthright and direct. And I think it's great that you are on Twitter. We do follow your social media as well. So everyone out there, please take up that offer and engage with His Excellency personally. All right, over to you, Iskandar, for the next session.